good morning, good afternoon. So we're very excited to be joining you guys today to talk about what the AI industry can learn from trust and safety. This was actually a panel originally planned for RightsCon Lusaka, but we are very pleased that the Integrity Institute was able to host and platform the conversation after that conference was actually cancelled at the very last minute. So I think to get us started, we'll do some introductions. So my name is Katelyn Edwards. I have some experience working in trust and safety at TikTok. I actually originally studied dystopian literature and society, and I always think it kind of comes back around. It's an appropriate education to be working in tech. I'm particularly interested in how digital systems kind of shape user experience and how we manage risk and how those operational details can contribute to a broader conversation in terms of safety and governance and emerging technology. And I'm also involved with the Violence Reduction Unit in London, and I'm on the comms committee here at the Integrity Institute. I will pass over to Jen, who's going to do a brief introduction as well.
Hey everyone, my name is Jen Weedon. I'm currently a researcher and lecturer at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, where I teach trust and safety, among other things. And my whole career has been about thinking through what could go wrong. I had spent many years in industry. My longest tenure was at Meta, where I worked leading teams and orgs focused on emerging harms. I worked at Niantic, which is a gaming company, and they're focused on red teaming and safety by design. And now sort of in academia at the intersection of AI safety, platform integrity, and trust and safety. I also consult sometimes with Vice. I am an academic affiliate with the Global Network Initiative, and I'm on the research team at the Digital Trust Council. I'm also an elected school board member. So lots of things going on. And I'll pass it over to Chanell.
Thank you very much. Yes, I just finished reading The Parable of the Sower, which is one of my an amazing dystopian fiction book and feels very relevant for our times. But yeah, in addition to worrying about that stuff, I work at a government-funded organization in the UK that is there to help businesses experiment with and adopt new technologies, including AI, but it will also be working across things like quantum, as we're thinking about what it means to commercialize that with different use cases for businesses. And I came into this type of role after being working in trust and safety at Depop and Meta as well. And in my pre-tech career period, I was also working in areas of offline safety. So things like peacekeeping missions with the UN, where I'd be deployed in conflict-affected countries and serving alongside the military, but also with things like product safety and trade policy with China, or environmental protection and those kind of things. And so, yep, and now I'll pass it over to Diane. Yep.
Hi, I'm Diane Chang. I'm so excited to be here with this amazing panel with such a fascinating, wide-ranging background. That's ultimately actually what makes both the trust and safety field and the Integrity Institute member base, I feel like, so rich and fun every time we get together for these discussions. I have spent most of the last decade building products and platforms that connect people to high-quality information, whether it's civic information, news, or critical business information. As a product person, and like a lot of people that have worked in trust and safety, I've actually made the move from trust and safety to AI safety, in part because there's so many similarities, and I'm so glad we're talking about this today. Currently, I'm at Google as a product manager working on making Gemini models work well to be trustworthy and high quality for enterprises. And immediately prior to this, I spent 2 years at the Canadian AI company Cohere, also focused on model post-training as well as the agent platform products, making them safe and secure and trustworthy for business customers around the world. Prior to that, I also have spent time at Meta leading the civic integrity product teams. And then before that, worked on a wide range of news recommendation, content recommendation type products. I also am very happily a board member of II supporting this fantastic community. Really glad to be here. Handing back to you, Katelyn.
Perfect. Yeah, so I think you can tell from the range of experience and the depth of experience of the panel that this is going to be an interesting conversation, drawing upon the parallels between trust and safety and the AI industry. When we were kind of preparing, we were reflecting on the fact that trust and safety was really born out of the need to develop ways to understand and respond to complex and fast-moving harms online, and to kind of balance like technical systems, human judgment, and with a lot of uncertainty at often very large scale. So considering AI is becoming the next major site of investment, experimentation, and consequently user harm, I think this session is going to consider what the emerging AI ecosystem can learn from the people and practices that have already been navigating these challenges in lots of different contexts and companies, and how risk, safety, accountability, and intervention can translate across different fields, and where new approaches may in fact be needed. So I think to get us started, our opening question was to do with how each of these fields of trust and safety and AI might define safety within those different spaces. So where are the similarities and the differences? And I think, Chanell, we're going to start with you.
Yep, sure. So I think that this is a question I find interesting because I can see definitely how much it's been evolving over time with different types of audiences as well, and also with different types of sectors specifically, because that's something I'm very aware of. And so, yeah, like thinking about this from the context of like, we think about we definitely have that view of like traditional, the more traditional kind of online safety aspect. And there potentially like, there's that kind of big focus on what it means to be like protecting people, but purely in that kind of, information sharing remit. But it's actually, like I think something that is becoming a lot more apparent in, especially when people working on, AI fields and are thinking about what it means for not just the developers, but also the people adopting the technology as well. What that means across different types of audiences, but also different types of sectors. I think that it's something that kind of becomes a lot more context dependent, I think. I mean, there's always an element of context dependent when you're thinking about information exchange, but definitely something that's on my mind is a lot is, let's say, for example, a project that I'm, thinking about a lot at the moment is thinking about what it means for AI in manufacturing contexts. And there, like, you're like, it could literally be kind of like the system goes wrong, a finger gets cut off, or like the wrong ingredients go into food and then food like that has kind of residual effects that may not be detected. And so yeah, I think that that's something that I do think about in terms of those kind of that kind of safety lens, and something that's quite specific with the AI industry as a whole, or that think about this as the AI kind of ecosystem even, because it's not just about the industrial players, is that it for people that kind of are coming, especially from a kind of trust and safety background, there's actually a lot more. It's like a much larger pool of needs and considerations to play with, which makes it quite. Yeah, I think it makes it a lot of opportunities in different areas there.
Yeah. Yeah, so harm can mean so many different things in each of these different contexts. Thank you. Diane and Jen.
I can pop in on some aspects of this. I think within trust and safety, and even if you ask one trust and safety professional and another, kind of what they perceive the scope of their role, it could differ dramatically, and I think that is not a bad thing. It just means the sort of context in which you're doing this work and the lens that you take. So it can all many different roles can have trust and safety aspects, but traditionally at the highest level, trust and safety has been about sort of safety or protection, and the words used actually is a pretty are important in terms of like, are you protecting someone from something, are you optimizing for well-being? Like, these are very different frames, but trust and safety, it's usually been about sort of the humans, right? Whether their emotional well-being, their physical well-being, their sort of comfort with sort of consuming information, the sort of cognitive well-being. Security, on the other hand, is often about sort of protecting data or information sort of systems there. With AI safety, often these two kind of lenses get commingled. And so I think that there's differences in terms of like the locus of focus with regard to safety, that I think AI safety and security tends to blend a bit more than traditional trust and safety has. I also think that similar to trust and safety, AI safety has dynamics around like, it also has its own discipline of like, bias and fairness. And there's a whole field of folks who have been kind of shaping this and trying to measure it for a long time, that often haven't maybe neither the field of trust and safety nor the kind of legacy field of AI safety. Maybe they haven't discussed as much, or kind of populated their own kind of taxonomies of harm and frames of risk, how they think about things, et cetera. And I think this also relates to like what types of expertise are valuable in a given field. And I think in the AI safety space, a lot of the expertise is slightly different. It might be more either kind of folks who come from machine learning backgrounds, or folks who are coming from this topic from a different perspective than trust and safety. So I think there's similarities, there's differences, but I think that overall, as I think AI is both changing like the nature of safety work in general, as well as how safety work is done. And then lastly, like the sort of, for me, the elephant in the room is like, who defines what's harm, and like what is, what is near-term versus long-term harm? Are we worried about long-termism or existential risks versus stuff happening now? And that is a very similar discussion played out in trust and safety with regard to how to think through that. So I think there's just so many aspects to this question that it's hard to nail down one. Diane, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I think you've really captured it. I think the one other dimension I throw in there that I see is so similar, and this is what makes both fields so similarly complex and interesting, but also challenging, is that in the trust and safety fields, right, we see very different kinds of harms and therefore solutions manifesting when it comes to, for instance, B2B or marketplace type platforms, where maybe you're more concerned about like fraudulent fraud or fake accounts or spam, versus social media platforms where you're worried about things like CSAM, content-driven harms, informational harms. And then similarly within Gen AI, because these models are being used for such a wide variety of purposes, the kind of harms and risks you see, what safety is defined as in businesses. When I was working on this stuff within enterprise focused context, most businesses, they don't necessarily think of safety in terms of content harms. Like they want that taken care of. They want to make sure there's no CSAM, right? But most workers, they expect to kind of behave themselves and not be using a model that's provided to them to create CSAM. They're more concerned about security, as an example. So the kind of context of deployment of these technologies in different types of product surfaces, how they're mediated, the kinds of end users, that really, there's so much variation here. That's what makes it so challenging. And to Jen's point also, yeah, who defines the harm? Which ones matter the most? There's so many different, similar dynamic to the trust and safety field here in terms of how we make those decisions.
Yeah. I think kind of listening to you guys, it's really evident that there's like a quantitative and qualitative like metric tension between trying to measure and mitigate risk and harm in both of these spaces, and then also working out who the harm is kind of being inflicted upon is going to change the context for those definitions. So I think it would be interesting for us to talk a little bit about how trust and safety kind of matured and has consequently got lots and lots of learnings and experiences, but those do vary based on the size and the business model of the individual companies. There isn't kind of an absolute one-way approach for trust and safety to be built out. So how do we think that specialization within trust and safety versus the AI space, what's this going to mean for the skills and experience and the support structures for the people and systems that are navigating both of these fields? Diane, maybe I can invite you to chat a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe I could speak directly from experience. When I went to Cohere, it was a Series C startup or scale up around the cusp of raising its Series D. So, total size of the company was a few hundred employees, which is so different in size from like a Meta. But the product itself, as I mentioned, even though it's used mostly in business context, we did have a small SaaS platform where we wanted to allow developers from enterprises to be able to start testing it out. So we needed to be able to ensure that even the low probability harms like CSAM, we had detection in place, we had interventions in place. I, at Meta, had specialized in information harms or a range of harms, including the transition of online harms to offline harms, but specific to civic contexts. And that is so different from a platform where you might have to worry about CSAM, as an example, along with the Gen AI specific concerns such as fairness in all kinds of business contexts. So it definitely was very challenging to figure out, how do I really quickly build the expertise on a new area of safety and harm in order to be able to ensure that I'm learning and capturing the best of what we know from what is similar to the trust and safety field versus what do I adapt that's unique to this set of products. And that's where, this community within II, so many people, I put out the call and so many people very helpfully stepped up. We had so many enriching conversations and shared notes afterwards on just collecting the shared knowledge and within the community, also for anyone else who's at a smaller organization that needs to kind of kickstart some of these operations. So I think that's where there is, and my hope is for the AI safety industry to not have to reinvent the wheel, but leverage a lot of the collective wisdom, the best practices that already exist within the trust and safety field, so that they can focus the additive and new solutions to what is specific to and new to the Gen AI products and platforms.
Yeah, I think that there's an aspect of professionalization that the trust and safety field kind of went through, and a sort of painful maturity curve. I would like to think that, and the sort of steps along that maturity curve is sort of like, I think it also, like Diane mentioned, kind of depends a lot on the size of the business, right? Or like, so for example, working at Meta for a long time in trust and safety or in integrity was, I was on fairly specialized teams, and sort of got very deep, but also had to have the sort of the T-shaped expertise, right? So like we got very deep, but we also had to have an understanding of like all of our cross-functional partners and sort of like what they needed and whatnot. And then going to Niantic, which was way smaller, way less mature and kind of mechanic around like, the sort of scaffolding and architecture of trust and safety wasn't set up. So it was, had to be a generalist immediately. And there were very clear kind of areas in which standards and best practices, like the types put out by DTSP, the TSPA, even Integrity Institute, although those came out a little bit later than when I started because I'm ancient. That provides like a really helpful, I think, grounding, not only for people who are joining the field, but also as kind of like organizational legitimacy, right? Because if you can point to something and be like, yes, there's a field that exists where you can go to school or you can have this career path, or like there's these kind of cluster of skill sets. I think that happened a bunch in TNS, but I don't think was ever fully, I think what's happened in the last year and a half sort of has blown up a lot of that. I do think that, at least from a hiring manager and as a person that's been in this field for a really long time, I think the unique value of folks who have worked in trust and safety or who excel in trust and safety are that they tend to be systems thinkers. They tend to be very creative and curious and able to anticipate what's next. They're very comfortable in ambiguity because that's like literally what you have to do because it's a constant change. And now with, the way that AI is changing everything, I think that those skills are even more important. I think having one thing that I would love to see kind of more discussed in the AI safety context is like knowing, there's sort of responsible AI governance frameworks and all of these things that are geared towards like having the right process, right? But like not everything can be standardized, and there's a place for things that follow the best processes, but there's also things like how do we encourage capacity for thinking around corners? This is where a lot of my red teaming work comes in, but like how do you teach people how to do that? How do you create organizational space to do that, especially in environments now where there's a lot of litigation or like there's just concerns about investing and looking proactively for harms or potential harms where companies do that, they may find themselves having to deal with things that they weren't anticipating. So the tensions between what can get standardized versus like what do we want to leave space for to be creative in terms of thinking about the next harms coming down the pike. And then lastly, one thing, this is maybe better suited for another question, but I think the positioning of AI safety is interesting. Like right now, it's often couched in like governance, and that one of the areas that I think anyone in trust and safety could speak to is this positioning within trust and safety is like, is it a cost center? That kind of like, how do we position as a differentiator and a business value add versus not? And I think that's something where trust and safety sometimes does that well, sometimes hasn't. And it to me, this seems to be happening a little bit in the AI safety space, but more around trustworthiness, because I guess I'd be curious about the rest of the panel's thoughts on like how AI companies are positioning their safety efforts as differentiators or not, or if there's more opportunity to do that, and if there's anything to learn or not learn from trust and safety on that specific front.
I think, I guess on a related point, something that I was thinking about with this question is how significant it is to be in a space within the wider kind of AI space where it's, you definitely have like those kind of, let's say the more kind of typical tech companies that we would be used to that will be like working on developing the technology, not just, generative AI kind of companies, but also like a lot of companies, a huge amount of companies, in fact, that are actually working on very small levels with different types of AI technologies on like more kind of focused issues outside of a kind of LLM generative AI world. But then where you have like even more, I would say like kind of think like this in terms of like job opportunities or more needs for people with this kind of specialization is on that adopter side because of the type of risks that are involved and the scale of risks that are involved and what that means for business bottom lines, like related to the point you were making, Jen. It's like, I think with AI, it's actually absolutely a lot more recognized that if you are working with a problematic technology, it will actually cause kind of financial harm to you in a very immediate way. So yeah, like there's a huge amount more opportunities available for people that are actually working on that like adoption phase because actually we're approaching a point now where every bank has to have somebody that's able to navigate AI risk. Like I know people that are working in kind of jewelry companies and fashion retailers that like where there are these jobs available, construction companies, like school district areas, like there's just so many different areas where people are needed that are able to operationalize regulatory policies and standards, but also being able to navigate those like gray areas and respond to unanticipated things. And I think that because of the nature of this technology, like there's probably a lot more opportunities for people to be able to really specialize on these very, very niche areas. Like if that is something that does align to their interests. Like right now I'm working with a wind farm operator and different innovators working in this area. And I did not realize how fascinating I would find like, the deployment of different AI technologies and physics-based, AI algorithms for like maintaining, wind turbines or something like that. Yeah. But I think that this kind of ability to flex with different types of risks is something that I think it becomes such a core skill because it's something that people in trust and safety have to do every day. Like every day you're facing a new risk that you didn't anticipate before. And I think that in this kind of landscape, it actually is just, for me at least anyway, I just see it as an evolution of that. Like for a lot of people, this may sound like completely opposite things, but I do remember, suddenly being in a new job where I had to become, an expert on counterfeit trainers in a week. Like it doesn't really feel that different. Yeah.
Yeah, the one other aspect I'd add to this is like the story of like trust and safety and AI safety almost has to be placed within the history of like how society has come to be impacted by a range of like mass market technologies, right? Like the number of surveys, I believe by Pew, and there was an initiative I took part in at Cohere run by the Stanford Deliberative Democracy Lab, where we similarly talked to a wide range, surveyed a wide panel of folks in the US and also in India as two countries that are on absolute opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the average person's trust in generative AI. And in the US context, we've seen across the board, like trust in institutions has fallen to an all-time low, and trust in technology, of course, goes along with that. Trust in tech companies as well as the products we produce very much tracks with overall low institutional trust. Whereas in India, from a very early days of LLM chatbots being available, the average user has very much and very quickly adopted and trusted, come to say they really trust the information that's provided to them. And so I think these contexts are really important for us to understand as we're building these products, again, that we can't have one size fits all solutions. And that was a very costly lesson that those of us working in social media had to learn from getting it wrong, that I hope at this point the Gen AI field can learn from trust and safety.
Yeah. No, yeah, super interesting. And I think, yeah, a lot of us can probably relate to that idea of having to become an expert in a very niche kind of problem area in a very short space of time. And the sheer like quantity of content that you might be exposed to in both trust and safety and the AI industries means that, yeah, the problems kind of keep coming. I think that the next area that might be interesting to discuss is we've kind of spoken about the positives and the lessons that we would want to take moving forwards. What about those that we don't? So any lessons from trust and safety that we shouldn't be exporting to AI safety? And I think, Diane, you're going to kick us off, if that's okay.
Yeah, actually, it's very related to the last thing I shared. It is very much this like understanding where solutions can't be one size fits all, because your user base, they're, in every single country or region, they're operating in a different context. In like a low trust context like the US, I think the positive way to look at this is there is more inherent incentive for companies now to build trust, not just perception, but really actually design their products to be worthy of user trust, because it will help with adoption. But that, what makes people in one population trust and actually prevent harm to them is not necessarily the same as people from another country or another culture who experience harm in different ways, who may perceive harm in different ways as well and require different solutions. So I think really being mindful about how to adapt and customize both one's risk calculation and assessment to different populations of users, and not expecting to just port what works in the US or in the Western world to the rest of the world is going to be a super important lesson.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this through the lens of like, what is actually like what lessons from TNS are still relevant given sort of the way that the internet is shaped and our relationship to it is just changing so dramatically. But I think there's a couple themes that, in addition to what Diane said regarding like not having, again, perpetuating the same assumptions that, use and sort of threat models of like people sitting in San Francisco, being widely applicable to everything. We all know that, but it's still is something that is, I think, very much a thing. So one is, like I mentioned before, the kind of framing and positioning of safety work within companies, right? Like I think, trust and safety grew up at a fairly unique time period. And I think this is both a positive and a negative. Like there's so many of us that came out of Meta, which is amazing. But also that's an experience that is not necessarily, as we all know, universal. And so, but even, when I've moved and worked with different trust and safety teams in different organizations, sort of this whole, like, how does trust and safety kind of fit within the org, and what is its value, and how does it position itself? And like, how does it, that I think is something that often went sideways, not because of any failure or like decisions at any point in time, but because of just a mix of kind of company narratives, journalist narratives, a whole kind of conflation of things that I think tends to oversimplify and gives a bad rap, I guess, maybe bad rap, but is too simplistic a term. So the positioning and framing is like this being a real market differentiator would be helpful versus, which again, as someone who values the sort of ethics and people side of things, I don't love the idea of kind of reframing it, but I also know that to be effective, framing it well is important, especially for investors or people who are, choosing to spend money on certain technologies. That like if we can find a way to get people to make decisions on technologies or companies that do invest in responsible development and trustworthiness, like that's another kind of way. I would say another kind of thing that is happening is and this is fairly, I think, common with some of the more frontier model companies, but a lot of the folks who came out of traditional trust and safety are going to some of the frontier model companies and replicating a lot of the same organizational structures and cross-functional mechanics. And I think that is good in the sense that, like, okay, there's some best practices that have been learned, but I also wonder what biases, whether for action or inaction or perspectives, are we just kind of like facsimile, moving from one big tech environment to the next without kind of evaluating, like, is this actually the best way to do things? So that's sort of one angle that I feel like might be better, should be more explored, as well as, trust and safety is we talk about how it's incestuous. Maybe incestuous isn't the right word, but it's a fairly smallish community where people know each other. And so that can be great because you've already built trust and you kind of understand how people work. But it also means, again, that you're just sort of shifting the same operations in new contexts, which doesn't leave space for new ways of thinking or new people. And then, yeah. So I think those are some of my contributions there, as well as, this is a topic I've been chatting about with some people, the vendors that work in this space, right? Whether they're doing kind of AI safety testing or evals, or if they're providing kind of leads for investigations, like, a lot of those folks often have a very specific background or way of thinking. And as they reinvent themselves for, the AI era, also, like, what does that also mean for, again, coverage of harms or ways of thinking? So I guess my big kind of meta observation here is this is also an opportunity for us to, like, potentially rethink some of the things operationally that we do, because the environment is very different now than it was, 10 years ago when this all started.
Yeah, I guess, and I think it relates to that point about the environment being different. Like, I mean, one of the things that I'm still very aware of, thinking about this personally, is what I would call, like, one of my bad habits with how I see the differential between kind of, what the company does in terms of, like, what the tech company does and, like, what those impacts of those actions are. And I think that because my first job in a tech company was at Meta, and my next job afterwards, it was at a British company that ended up getting bought by an American tech company. And I think it gave me a very particular lens of seeing, like, well, we tried our best, but actually this harm still happened, and that's just the way it is. Because I think that was a lot of the culture at the time. Like, we, let's say with social media, there is, despite all the efforts, we know there's still a lot of bad stuff that still happens. And companies get away with, like, trying, but they don't necessarily have to stop all of those bad things happening. And I think that something that's very different, especially in this part of the world, especially being in the remit of, like, the EU AI Act and the new, European product liability directive that's going to become a big thing, I imagine, next year when it starts to apply, is that the way of seeing, like, the impacts of technology and what it means to be contributing to harm, like, carries a lot more responsibility in the AI space than it carried when I was in those kind of more traditional trust and safety roles, especially if you're working on, if you're a company that adopts a technology without doing the right kind of impact assessments or, checks on how that could affect your users, but also if you're, an AI developer that's actually promising the world and not delivering what you promise, including in, like, your risk management approach, or you're making mistakes that when you can't verify that you've gone through an adequate governance approach, including consulting the right experts to actually understand those areas of risk before you deployed it. And I think, yeah, I mean, even in the US, like I talk about this in a EU context, but even in the US, like it's very interesting to see how consumer protection law is being applied to AI products and services in a way that was never done, at least to my knowledge, when it comes down to kind of more, those kind of social media type online harms. And I think that, yeah, but for me, it's definitely a mentality shift, and it's something that I think about, especially, when I'm doing things in analysis. There's a very common in the AI safety, AI governance world of doing things like those impact assessments and those risk assessments, and having a kind of documented like process around that has to be signed off by certain levels of the company. And I think all of those different types of things, like it formalizes a lot more, but actually I think, yeah, it makes it, to me, I feel like that's a very positive shift that isn't natural for my trust and safety brain, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of the legislation, but also the systems are hopefully being a bit more prescriptive about responsibility and about what individual companies have to have in place in order to mitigate these harms before they occur. I think that's a really appropriate kind of segue into a bit of a conversation about the kind of reactivity versus proactivity. So we've spoken a bit about the different, like the EU AI Act and Digital Safety Act. And I think that aside from that, like legal perspective, I'm curious what you guys think about like safety by design and kind of embedding in the product and in the systems, functions that will hopefully protect users. Jen, I think if you are happy to kick us off.
Yeah. So I think on this front, there's, such a big differentiator between having discussions on safety by design at, say, social media companies or gaming companies, where you sort of, in some ways, control your kind of surface, right? Like, and you have control over maybe unless you have an app store or other things like that. But in general, you have policies and you can, sort of have discussions with folks who are developing products. But with different aspects of AI, the scope of accountability or responsibility, to what Chanell was saying, is diffuse depending on where you are in the value chain, right? So like if we're talking about safety by design at the frontier kind of model level, like, I think the Thorn report, or, there's a report that came out a couple of years ago on safety by design for generative AI development, particularly around child safety. There's sort of guidelines and the no ending, tons of frameworks and sort of governance mechanisms to kind of think through harms and do the, kind of depending on the size of your company, checklist and analysis and whatnot. But I think that with aspects of AI, we see a lot of like sort of Spider-Man meme situations where it's, there's an opportunity to be more proactive, but like depending on if you're talking to a deployer who's building something who maybe is just doesn't have the skills, time, or maybe has some like very basic sort of due diligence they want to do, but like you can't expect everyone to be a safety by design expert, or not everyone has the resources to hire folks. And so there's a practicality here around where in this chain are we talking about safety by design, right? And like, what does that mean? And if we're talking about like the model layer, the systems layer, like a feature, it's sort of, I think, takes a lot of different permutations. I also think that like, there's back to what we were talking about earlier with regard to like who defines what harm is and like where the lines are, right? There's, and this also gets back to like expertise and weight within the company of saying like, okay, like we can be proactive about preventing some kinds of harms, but in other cases, we know that there is a likelihood, and maybe they put in controls or safeguards, but harm will still happen. But what's important there is that there should be a feedback loop of when something happens, are people sort of digesting and much like we've talked about in trust and safety ad nauseum from a content moderation standpoint, it's hard to be fully proactive without also understanding, okay, now that our product is already out there, how do we then kind of plug the gaps to then, kind of get better at being more proactive, because we know maybe we've anticipated things, or maybe things that happened we didn't anticipate. Hopefully we learned from that, and then we get better at thinking proactively. But without a clear feedback loop, or without a sense of like how our companies, what is that pipeline between like identifying harms at a given time, whether if it's pre-deployment or post-deployment, and how are things getting patched or fixed or whatnot. That to me is like a necessary. It is positioned in the reactive state, but it's a critical part of being able to think proactively, because if you don't know how things are actually happening, again, it's all sort of just conjecture. I also think that there's a lot of work to be done at strengthening, obviously, the evaluations ecosystem, and also kind of what we talked about earlier, that the fact that I'm not sure how big proactive efforts are at different size companies now in terms of thinking through harm, particularly because also, like what we talked about before, the legal concerns on like investing in proactively poking for and looking for vulnerabilities there. In some instances, in cybersecurity, there's kind of like more of a framework for that. In safety areas, it's a little bit different. And so it's a long-winded way of saying, like, I think that there are certainly guides and incentives from a regulatory and compliance perspective to be proactive. I think that there are other aspects of operations that would help for proactivity that I'm not as confident they exist, or they're not being talked about openly for various reasons. I also wonder, like, how often do people read system cards or model cards and things like that, or like the risk analyses coming out of some of the bigger labs. I mean, there's people like us might read them for fun, but for random companies that are trying to do this on their own under a lot of pressure to get stuff out, they just don't have that ability. So like, what's the right balance between a lot of us steeped in like people who do this all day, every day, versus like the vast majority of people deploying, systems might not have that luxury. So I'm curious what other people think on this topic, though.
Yeah, I definitely struggled with a lot of the proactive versus reactive discussion broadly, both within the industry and also on the regulatory policymaker side. I think there's always inevitably going to be, ways in which we will be reactive. We can't avoid that, right? But I think the goal should always be to be primarily proactive wherever possible, so that you can secure the bandwidth to have that reactivity happen only when it's truly novel and emerging harms. As an example, we've seen all kinds of really unfortunate and tragic mental health consequences of real users using consumer chatbots and companion chatbots that maybe we could have somewhat anticipated, but the actual way that they played out did take the industry a little bit by surprise. So these kind of emergent new harms are, this is like a new set of technologies that's oftentimes what's going to happen, and you need to be able to have teams that can quickly react and respond in those situations. But a lot on the proactive side, there have been attempts to move to a more proactive kind of posture, and this is where it becomes kind of a challenge to have consensus around proactive in what way, proactive for whom. As an example, the EU AI office worked on the EU AI Act well before ChatGPT was introduced to the world, right? So they were targeting forms of AI that were not necessarily mass market Gen AI. And so after the ChatGPT moment, the way that the EU AI office tried to build in some sort of a mechanism to be somewhat proactive was to get the major frontier model labs to come up with agreement and sign on to these voluntary agreements known as the EU AI Code of Practice. And this is where they hired independent researchers, mainly from academia, to come up with an outline on the types of harms they were most concerned about, which primarily were speculative existential risks, things like use of Gen AI for nuclear harms, for bio attacks. And while these absolutely are possible, the probability is low, and there's so many dependencies that have to happen in order for even if a model is capable enough to, like, let's say, build a nuclear weapon. It's not like me, rando AI user, can go to like my local bodega and buy some nuclear material and get the AI to give me like a recipe so I can bake up a nuclear bomb, right? Like there's so many other things that have to happen. And so when I was at Cohere, which as I mentioned is also building a frontier model, but a smaller company, it became very challenging to say, hey, we have to essentially be required to test every model for a nuclear disaster, when that's so like, it's like designing a car to prevent it from being a missile that can like blow up the moon, when it's right now designed to just be a car. And the resourcing that we would have to allocate, that would be taking away from resourcing put towards some of the efforts that we knew with very high certainty were going to be very important to mitigate real harms in the near term. As an example, our models were being used by real business customers, integrated into human resources systems for things like talent management and recruitment, right? And of course, there's like a wealth of science as well as real regulation around preventing bias in hiring, discrimination bias in hiring and human resources. And so we built actually the first evaluation for LLM specifically to measure if the model, when used to, for instance, review and summarize resumes, would be biased when it came to resumes with indicators of different, representing people of different races. There had been a wealth of science on AI used in other forms of AI used to look for fairness in this way, but it was the first evaluation for LLMs. And that was really important work. Like there are real customers that were really concerned about this, because both from an ethical standpoint and also there's real laws around this, right? So that's resourcing we would have had to take away from building evaluations like that, doing research like that, towards preventing the nuclear bomb type problems. And so I think this question of like, how do we be proactive? How do we come to consensus as society and where we want companies to be proactive? Where do we want the policymakers to pay attention to protect us now, and also for the emerging things that might happen later? These are all, there's no easy answers here, but for people who are maybe the most vulnerable to certain issues and harms and scenarios, this continues to be a problem where I think collectively we've learned a lot from other technologies. We have mature civil society, we have consumer protection groups. I think collectively, ideally, we can have broader consensus on what are the near-term harms and positive outcomes that we want to see, and then build that kind of pressure both from the external standpoint and then also within the companies to reflect that, to say we care about the near-term things equally as much as what could potentially happen down the line. And we are ready and prepared to keep an eye out so that if something unexpected happens, we're ready to jump into action.
Yeah. Oh, Katelyn, before you go on, can I just ask Diane a quick follow-up question?
Yeah.
I just was, so you mentioned that like the mental health and some of the tragedies around that was a surprise to industry. Do you think that was a surprise to industry or like to trust and safety folks working at these companies? Or I guess I'm like, where do you think the surprise focus was, or who was surprised by these things?
It feels like trust and safety folks were not at all surprised, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't always seem like the folks who work on trust and safety are the ones who necessarily are doing product development within Gen AI, for sure.
Yeah.
I think just to come in with a different perspective on this as well, because I think something that does give me optimism actually in some aspects, I think, with what it means to be a lot more proactive, is definitely thinking about things like, for example, what it means for companies to be able to get like, corporate insurance on their services when they're integrating AI technologies, and what they have to prove to insurance companies about like how they're thinking about navigating those risks, like what kind of processes and standards and things they're using, but also, I guess, going back to that point of the model card of who's reading it, but actually how they're actually feeling, why they actually feel confident that this supplier is actually a trustworthy supplier for them as well. And I do think as well that things like, like we see a lot in the type of work we do, because we work with a lot of kind of, we work on support programs for a lot of early stage innovators as well. But the level of investor due diligence around this is growing like every month, like it's before. I think it's very different if you're talking about these like multiple billion-dollar valued companies and things like that are just able to get a lot from their name. But actually for most companies operating in this space, they actually do have to be able to demonstrate why they feel like, their product won't be taken off the market in 6 months, because of a safety or risk concern. So I think that there's these kind of things that definitely do give me hope, especially, and as well, like the things like the use of impact assessments. Like I feel like if I had the ability to be able to pause the introduction of new product features in my previous roles and be like, okay, let us go through this thorough risk assessment process and actually know that we can't answer these questions until we engage external experts to give us their view. Like rather than being in a meeting where I have 1 hour to give a load of things and then it still might be overruled anyway. Like that would have just meant a very different type of process with what I was used to working with in a trust and safety context. But I do think that I think it's like going back to points that have been made by Diane and Jen, is that while I think that there's a lot of protections there for what it means to be able to, give your technology to kind of, economic actors who you have to listen to because otherwise they won't sign a contract. Like I feel like there's a lot of protection there, including things, like in the financial sector, there's at least, in a lot of different contexts, you can see like the way that financial organizations have been able to use their power to block new models being released. And, in a UK context, like make sure all companies are adhering to a consumer code of duty when they're thinking about how their AI is being used. But actually for the average consumer, like, I feel like there's a lot more people that become susceptible to being the testing ground for new technology. Um, And I feel like in that way, that for me is like where the bigger concern is actually. It's like we know that there's still experiments happening, including what it means to understand and measure the impacts, and that is happening in real life in a way that I think it's going to be different, going to be more concerns than I've had about kind of other types of technology being used by children or my mother or different things, yeah.
Nice. I think, yeah, I mean, really, really rich conversation. We had planned for a rapid fire round at the end. However, in the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that you can choose whether to answer what are the skills and experience that TNS practitioners or civil society can be contributing towards this conversation, or you can answer if in 5 years the AI industry has learnt the appropriate lessons from trust and safety, what might that look like? So just a sentence or two from each of our panelists today, if anyone has an idea to get us started.
I mean, for the oh, sorry, carry on.
No, go ahead. You go. You go ahead.
I was going to say for the first one, I would say that I wouldn't underestimate how big a skill it is to be able to take a very, like in real time when there's an ongoing risk happening, to be able to operationalize like an idea into, and really being able to execute it to the best of your ability, and the level of creative thinking that happens around that, and stakeholder engagement and things like this. I think there were so many of these things that were regular parts of like, the daily or hourly roles in trust and safety areas, that I can see that within the AI industry, a lot of people that are working in AI governance for like extended period of time are still trying to grapple what that means in practice and how to get their head around that.
That like crisis response in real time.
Yeah.
Nice, thanks, Jen.
I was just going to say, I hope that the sort of AI safety community has communities like this, that the trust and safety kind of community has built a professional practice, but as well as a community support system, and that there a lot of us are kind of have gone through a lot, and I only want sort of AI safety folks to have or to not have the same perpetual cycle of burnout. Although I think that's a tall ask, but that's what I would wish for.
Yeah, that's a nice one.
Plus one to that, and I'll just say I'm very heartened that I think TNS folks and a lot of folks that have gone from industry to civil society, what you have to offer is that You all are best positioned, are very well positioned to advocate for the lived experiences of real people who are on the receiving end of a lot of this technical innovation. And I think you all are very effective at translating that lived experience in a way that's understandable and really highlights the stakes. Like, why is this important? Why should I care, to the people that are just looking at, a P&L or a balance sheet from a business standpoint, and also to the technical people that maybe are very excited, understandably, by the potential of what these new technologies can do, but really help them understand, hey, there's real people at the other end of this, and there's a lot of potential for this to really enrich their lives. So let's also understand where it might go wrong, and let's build towards the good and not towards the harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really nice sentiment to end on. We have a couple of minutes. If anybody does have a Q&A, any questions, put them in the chat, or feel free to come off mute. But also recognizing that we are only a couple of minutes out of the hour. No, we've covered everything.
What are your aspirations for what the field could look like in 5 years, Katelyn? Putting you in the hot seat.
Yeah, I mean, I think the element of community that Jen, that you were speaking about, I think that's really, something that I can relate to. And I guess also just the recognition that like the trust and safety and AI safety spaces are like fighting a good fight, and not trying to be on the like restrictive end of a lot of the cool like innovation that's happening, that we're like integrated as part of that push towards impressive technologies, rather than against.
Hi, I just took myself off mute. My name is Keela Marie Granda, and I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been extremely informative, so very helpful. I'm kind of coming from an outside-in perspective. I do a lot of work around CSAM, CSE, that sort of thing, trafficking. And so this has been a real learning experience, and it's been the way in which you explained everything was, for me, very understandable and felt very kind of welcoming. So thank you for all you're doing. I think you guys are like the heroes of this work, and I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Perfect. I think, April, are we?
Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you again to our lovely panelists for today's session, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. With that, I'll go ahead and close out this session, and be on the lookout for this recording uploaded onto our socials, and we'll see you again at the next Integrity Institute event. If these events really interest you, please sign up to be a member or check out our website at integrityinstitute.org. See you there. Thank you again, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.